My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
The worlds of imaginative fiction contain many crystals of magical power. The Dark Crystal, Dilithium Crystals, Billy Crystal. But perhaps none are more magical than those at the heart of the Corruption of Pelursk.
Our first segment is a basic crawl.
The Corruption of Pelursk is a 60-page pocket dungeon adventure, so those pages are pretty small, written and designed by Shel Khan, published in 2018. And as a quick note, we're reviewing the PDF, but Shel sells a version of this module with fabric hex tiles, a fabric version of the map, a carrying pouch, and other goodies.
So the beginning parts of the module are essentially background and introduction. There's a section called Pelursk is an Island, in which we are given some basic details about the small island of Pelursk, the magical Pelurskite crystals that are found there, and the town of Black Lake that sits on the shores of the huge lake that the island of Pelursk is in the middle of. The next section is Approaching Black Lake, in which we are given some visual details about the approach to the town of Black Lake. The next section is Pelurskite crystals, in which we are given some more details about the Pelurskite crystals themselves. Continuing from there, we have a section called Mac Asgrel's Manor House. Mac Asgrel is the man who the people of Black Lake sell their scavenged Pelurskite to. He adds a big markup and then sells it on to the wider world. Then comes a section called Exploring the Town of Black Lake. We are given some details about the town itself and how the people there might react to the party members. The next section is called At the Shore of the Black Lake, where the party discovers that the lake water is boiling and that the shore is littered with hot, flawed Pelurskite. Next, we have a section called The Bell Inn, which is an inn run by a trio of women whose surname is Bellin, and each of these women are married to each other. They are Lynn, Bello, and Aji. They have many children together, and collectively they are pillars of the community. In this section, you can learn about many aspects of the town's history and connect up with important NPCs. Importantly, all of this material, Mac Asgrel, the encounters in Black Lake, all of it combined gives the party an opportunity to learn a number of important clues related to what is going on the island of Pelursk. And I'm going to go through those right now. They can learn that the Pelurskite crystals wash ashore near Black Lake. These are collected by the locals and sold to Mac Asgrel, as I mentioned. The people of Black Lake consider the island to be sacred, and only one person, at present a man named Orig, is allowed to travel to the island to periodically, quote, feed it with chicken bones and bits of meat so that it will continue to produce Pelurskite. I should note that that aspect is draped in mystery. It's something that the people just seem to accept. No one really questions why they need to bring bones to the island. The next bit they can learn is because only one person is allowed to go to the island, there is only one boat in the whole community, and that's a problem that the party has to actually contend with if they want to get to the island. They can learn that Orig and his boat have gone missing. A young woman, Margie, daughter of the Bellin women, and a sort of local rabble-rouser opposed to the Pelurskite trade, has also gone missing. And finally, they will learn that, as of late, the Pelurskite crystal is corrupted, and only the hot, useless crystals have been washing ashore, and that the Pelurskite trade has come to a standstill.
Having explored the town, we then move on to the physical centre of the mystery, the Isle of Pelursk, and this is also the Hex Crawl section. So this starts with a description of some things that the party will find along the shore of Pelursk, including evidence of Margie Bellin's presence on the island. Then we get to the hexes. There are 12 different hex types, which are written to be generic, so they can each be used multiple times as the party moves around the hex map and into new sections of the geography there. Then there are ghosts, 6 different ghost encounters where we meet some previous inhabitants of Pelursk, including members of an ancient people that used to live there. Ruins contains 6 different ruins encounters where we see evidence of the ancient civilization that used to be here. And then, rounding out this section of random encounters are the island attacks. 6 different encounters where the left-behind technology of the ancient civilization defends its island. At the centre of the island is the Pelurskite King, a tragic, horrifying figure who we will speak about somewhat more later. And then the conclusion of the scenario includes escaping the island and an angry mob waiting on shore, who are rather put out about the collapse of their entire economy. The party may encounter Margie Bellin and learn more about the recent history of the island, including Margie's encounter with the island feeder, Orig, and the murderous plot of Orig and MacAsgrel from years back.
So let's talk about ways we have used this module. Tom, I gather you've just read it.
I indeed have just read it on your recommendation.
I have run 4 sessions of World of Dungeons with this module. I will note that one of those 4 sessions was mostly just lead up to this, and so it didn't really involve any of the material from the module directly. So truly it was like 3 sessions, but it was like 3 good, solid 3-hour sessions running through this module. So things we liked about the module, I'll kick off by saying that I think the tone and structure of the module is actually pretty good. It is a nice little mystery. I found the material to be easy to navigate, and it has a very, very nice, sharp payoff at the end with the encounter with the Pelursk King and kind of wrapping up the mystery with Margie, Orig, and all that stuff. I like this kind of module in fantasy gaming where you have a town or a village with their own little kind of isolated culture that they do, they have, and there's some kind of like terrible mystery that's kind of hanging over things, and the party has rolled into town to either exploit the situation or to try to solve the mystery or whatever. But in any case, they get wrapped up in the town's troubles and the town's politics and all that stuff. And it also has kind of like a strong, very like kind of horror bent to it. And so everything in this module is kind of like really pings like what I like in fantasy gaming.
Yeah, it's nicely gothic, I think, in that sort of closed off communities way. They're not like necessarily physically isolated, but their culture and their defensiveness kind of locks them off from everybody else because they're all a bit guarded about the Pelursk, I guess. I think it's the secret that makes them isolated more than anything, which is quite nice.
Yeah, and it's not even so much the secret of the Pelursk itself, like because they sell it and all this stuff, like they engage in this, like, or at least prior to the events of this module, they engage in this brisk sort of international trade of Pelursk, right? Or at least MacAsgrel does. But the kind of mystery is what's happening on the island, right? Like, what are the people doing to get the Pelursk, right? And I find that this is something else I like about the module. It deals with like some really interesting themes of like religion and greed, which I assume Shell intended, but I don't know for sure. But I think it's really interesting that the people of Blacklake consider the island to be sacred. They know that there's just one person who can go to the island, who's allowed to go there, and that this person, quote, feeds the island. But they don't really question what that means, right? No one really questions it because, hey, the money's flowing, it's all good. I found that to be very applicable to certain political topics in my country vis-a-vis religion and greed. And so I thought it was very, very interesting. And I think that the module like very efficiently explores that. And I think it's structured in a way to help you like explore all those themes in a great way. Tom, what are your thoughts about things you liked? I have more to say, but I'll give you a chance here.
Oh, sure. I mean, you mentioned it's easy to navigate. I think that's a great thing about this format. I haven't seen this Pocket Dungeon format before. I liked it a lot, actually. And in fact, I kind of wish it went even further, doing more of what it does. Like, making even simpler blocks of text. The smaller your pages, the easier it is to get a wall of text at some points. I think you'd still have to go through and highlight things you were interested in, despite how it's laid out. So like maybe in, future ones, I think it would be great to include a little point crawl map, but that's a good bit of prep you could do just to show a diagram map, saying here's the town, here's the lake, here's the island, and a road off the edge saying, civilization 2 weeks this way. But, overall, that's like a quibble with what's basically a very well presented adventure. It's so easy to read through and see all the points brought up just when you need them. So when you get to the boat dilemma, which is also a thing I liked, I think there's only one boat and it's missing is a great, simple problem for a party to deal with. Yeah.
If I could just interject momentarily, it's a great little dilemma and it's honestly kind of hilarious. Like there is a basic hilarity to the idea that they only have one fucking boat and they're on a lake, right? And having played it, what I love about it is the sort of like, I don't know if absurdity is the right word, but like this sort of, but it is kind of absurd. Like this sort of like absurd thing about Black Lake culture really resonates with the players because they begin to think like, there's more going on here, right? Like they think the island is sacred. Okay. but no one really kind of knows why. Okay. And there's only one boat. And then we got this guy, Mac Asgrel, who's very, very committed to like controlling access to the island. And they start to like question like certain ways of doing business in Blacklake. And that little detail of like, there's only one boat is like part of that.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it's pretty good. And like you say, it's got that critique going on. I mean, it's the not even remotely veiled thing about capitalism is right in there, right? So it's sort of nobody complains as long as everything's fine. And they don't realize they're being massively ripped off by the elite merchant guy at the edge of town. It's pretty, fairly on the nose, but, you know, it's fine for all that.
I liked it. I mean, it's another one of the things I liked. I thought that, I mean, there's a lot of like sort of modern day politically progressive elements in the module. The critique of capitalism is the real obvious one, right? But also, you know, the people of Blacklake have very progressive views on partnering and marriage and things like that, as evidenced by the Bellins. And I actually really enjoyed that. And my players did too. My players like found that to be refreshing because most fantasy settings, it's so medieval Eurocentric or whatever, right? So it was kind of a nice touch.
I mean, moving on to the maybe bread and butter stuff, I thought the presentation of a lot of the text is good. My favourite bit is the ghost descriptions. I think they're all really evocative and eerie in slightly different ways, which is pretty good. And then you've got to love a scenario with a gimmick. And this one has a sort of special hex crawl mini game, which is, I assume, fun. But you ran it. How was it?
I didn't use it. So, what? Yeah, I know. Sorry. I didn't use it. But it might be helpful to explain to the listeners what it is. Like, you want to give them a quick, like, just rundown of what it is?
Oh, sure. So it's kind of, although actually this will play into the things I have questions about later. So rather than the hex map being a fixed thing that you move around into certain terrain that's marked on the island map, the island map is essentially a kind of hollow shell. There's a central point you could be aiming for, because I think it's glowing, which is probably a hint you should aim for.
It is. It's a big, giant glowing column in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, very subtle. But as you move into a new hex, you actually draw a random hex tile and put that down. And that determines which bit you're in. And of course, they can get recycled as you move along. So it's sort of like sort of halfway between a little jigsaw game and a traditional map hex crawl. It seems fun though, anyway.
Yeah. You know, I didn't use it mostly because I was playing online, so I wasn't going to really get to experience that anyway. And by the time we got to the actual like exploring Pelursk part of it, I was not running short on time, but I definitely wanted to get to the Pelurskite King and kind of like really show that off. And so what I ended up doing, and maybe I'll save this for like questions, but basically I sort of adapted it a little bit to kind of get through it a little more efficiently. I actually think that's one of the qualities of the module. I feel like this module probably scales pretty well to different numbers of sessions. So we did effectively 3 sessions, and in 3 sessions we were able to explore the mystery of Blacklake, explore the mystery of the island, have the encounter, you know, have all the stuff with Margie, get back to the island or get back to Blacklake and do all that, right? And it was great. It was fine. But I could totally see a situation where if you were running this as a one shot, maybe you start them going right to the island. Like maybe they have already acquired their boat, they're going to the island, and you just give them the backstory of what's going on in Blacklake. You just tell them that out of character or whatever, and then just get them straight to encountering, you know, ghosts and other elements of the island that sort of help reveal the bigger mystery, right? And I think you could comfortably do that in one shot. Or on the other end, you could probably do the full hex crawl procedure and get a couple of sessions just doing that, right? You know, outside of like Blacklake and everything, and maybe extend it to 4 or 5 sessions. No matter what, I think you're going to get the same payoff because of the Pelurskite King, which I want to talk about, as well as I think the mystery itself is like pretty well constructed and satisfying. So I actually think that's a quality of the module. So even though I didn't do the hex crawl portion, I was able to use the elements available in the module to very effectively honor what it was trying to do.
Yeah, well, nice. Well, I mean, let's talk about the Pelurskite King if we may, because that's pretty good. I think
it's really good. Yeah. So the Pelurskite King is great. So we should probably say that like we haven't talked much about the Pelurskite crystals, but basically the idea of the Pelurskite crystals is there are 3 types. There's like the flawless, pure white Pelurskite crystal, and that's the one that everybody wants, right? Then there is the flawed Pelurskite that is not really sold or traded at all. It's just kind of used by the locals. You have the blue ones that just, cast off light, and you have the yellow ones that give off warmth. So I think it's worth noting that on the approach to Black Lake and at different points in the module, you're exposed to the different types of Pelurskite. So you see the blue ones lining the road, right, to light the road. You see the yellow ones when you are at the Bell Inn and warming your hands over them or whatever. You see the white one, possibly, around Mac Asgrel's neck, okay? You have these opportunities to be exposed to the different colors of the Pelurskite, and that serves a really neat function when they finally get to the island. Because when they finally get to the island, you are able to use the color of the Pelurskite. It kind of subtly in some cases, or very directly in other cases, affects the player's expectations. So the Pelurskite King is a great example. The Pelurskite King is covered in this corrupted yellow Pelurskite. So the Pelurskite is presently corrupted. It's dull and yellow, and worse, it's hot and burning and useless, right? It's so hot. And when you first encounter the Pelurskite King, you see him covered in this crusted over, fused with this seriously flawed yellow Pelurskite. And so straight away, the players are kind of pinged of okay, well, this is a problem. Cause I've been trained to know that this type of Pelurskite is bad. But he's sitting on a large dais of pure white Pelurskite, right? Which sends its own message about power and how the ancient people of this island used the Pelurskite, right? And so straight away there's that, right? You've been kind of building up to this encounter with the Pelurskite King the whole time, right? And that build up involves the color of the Pelurskite crystals. It involves the various clues that you're learning about the bigger mystery. And it all kind of leads to the Pelurskite King, which is the grand payoff. So do you want to describe what the Pelurskite King looks like and how amazing it is?
If I can recall the details correctly, sure. He's essentially trapped in this throne, right? Which is sort of all glowing and steaming and shrouded in fog. And he himself has his eyes occluded by crystal growths and sort of vainly whimpers and tries to reach for food. He just wants to eat everything that comes within reach, and is this sort of cross between...
And he's a boy.
There's a boy inside.
It's
yeah,
a boy.
Yeah. It's this mewling but horribly dangerous figure. It sort of reminds me of... actually, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'm sure I've seen this sort of in some of the lower grade fantasy and action movies of the 90s, this kind of chair throne-bound being that eventually gets stabbed by the hero,
Yeah, it is something that I can't put my finger on it, but I feel it feels familiar, right? It has this sort of a comfortable familiarity. Actually, in the role play, it made it really easy to role play. He's sitting there, he's this boy, and the fact that he's a boy is super important because the bigger mystery involves the fact that the previous feeder of the island was a woman who did not want to seat a new boy on the Pelurskite throne and resisted it. And so Mac Asgrel and Orig murdered her, and you can encounter her ghost later, actually. They murdered her in order to install this boy onto the throne so they could keep the Pelurskite flow going, right? So yeah, you've got he's just this wretched, tragic figure. The body of Orig is near the dais, and he wants the pieces of the body, particularly the head, which has gotten out of his grasp. And if you bring him the head, he'll eat it, but he'll also confer with you and talk to you, or you can just choose to fight him and kill him, right? And the scene in play is so gruesome and so enjoyable. It's very, very fun to role play. And Shell did a really fantastic job of just describing it and laying out how you should approach this scene, because it truly is the payoff of the whole module. So let's talk about questions that we have. Tom, I know you have some here.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a philosophical question about the hex crawl section, which is that if it doesn't matter which way you go, is it still a hex crawl, or is it just kind of a random access railroad?
I don't know if I have any thoughts on this. I mean, it sounds like you do, though.
I don't know. I don't think I do, because I was curious about how the hex crawl part worked out in play, because to be fair, there is a bit about if you're heading for the center, sometimes you'll get lost and have to go a different way, because the idea of the random hexes is that the island has turned against you and is sort of making you lose your path. So I know there's it's maybe more of a time management thing than it is actually about exploring the geography of the island. But since we have no direct play experience of the hex crawl to find out,
yeah,
maybe people can write in and let us know.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct tells me that it probably works fine. I mean, I don't know. Like when I was reading it and I was like, and adapting it, my sense was that it's okay. I mean, your second question on the notes here, actually, my answer to your second question also applies to this first one, I think. So why don't you just ask your second one too?
Sure. For a bit of background, I would say that all of the stuff in the town is very much a sandbox in the kind of Rockstar Games mold. You know, here are the main things that you can interact with, but you can also wander around and do stuff. But once you get to the island, rather than having location encounters as sort of things you can come across and deal with after we've had all the ghosts and ruins and so on, it sort of goes back more into the trad RPG mold of here's the story that will unfold like this. And it sort of assumes that certain things happen. Like it assumes you find the missing boy and bring him back, that kind of thing. Now, obviously that works because it's tried and tested. That's why it's called trad game design. But did you find there was any sort of conflict between the switching from that sandbox mode to a slightly more linear mode, or did it just sort of play out fairly easily anyway?
I get what you're asking, because the module is honestly kind of set up to tell a story in a way, right? The text moves through every element in a way that if you were telling the story of Black Lake and the island of Pelursk, you would receive all this information in that way, to the point where the end, is a sort of a big reveal. The end, you're given all the really key, interesting background information, right at the end, almost like a Scooby-Doo thing, right?
Yeah.
Here's the big reveal, right? I'll tell you why I liked it. And I didn't think it was heavy-handed or railroady in general. So the way I prep games is, you know me, I don't use these modules as they're written. I rarely do that. I always just take the modules and move things around, recontextualize things, and kind of, stretch it and pull it apart so that I can use it the way I want to, right? And what I appreciate about this module structure is because it has kind of a mystery story structure in a sense, right? The way it's all kind of revealed to you, and very, maybe at the end especially, maybe a little kind of heavy-handed. But what I liked is it helped me as the GM very easily understand the intricacies of what was going on, both in the history of the town and in the present day, and how it was all being affected, how it was affecting different people, why Mac Asgrel and Orig made decisions they made, why the different ghosts are behaving the way they do, and how they connect up with the bigger mystery and all that stuff. And so I was able to easily process the whole story on a single read through. And then I just ran the game in the way I normally run a game, right? And so, little details about Margie that come out at the end in the module, I just put them somewhere in the middle because the players asked questions of people and asked certain types of questions that it kind of made sense that they would learn this thing about Margie's motives, or they would learn this thing about what Mac and Orig did or whatever, right? And so I was able to use all that material to essentially improv it, right? And to have the sandbox kind of all throughout. Now, in the hex crawl, what I didn't do the actual hex crawl. I knew about how many encounters I could do before I needed to get to the Pelursk King based off how many sessions I had. And that was about 3 encounters. So what I did was I just pulled the 3 ghost, ruins, and ancient defenses encounters that I thought best exemplified the flavor and the theme of the module, as well as helping reveal some of the backstory of the mystery. And it worked great. I thought it worked really, really well. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
The simple image of glowing crystals washed up on the shore of the lake, I think, is just really good. It's magical, a little bit weird. Those things shouldn't float. And it's, so just off kilter enough to tell you that you're somewhere strange.
And kind of disgusting because there are bugs burning on them, sizzling and frying on the crystals on the beach.
It's a good point.
There's one particular ghost encounter where we see a trio of ancient cultists leading a boy to the center of the island to be the next Pelursk King. It's essentially a sort of ghostly echo of something that happened millennia in the past, but it's a super powerful encounter, and it really, really helps the players unfurl the greater mystery of the island of Pelursk, that this was an ancient civilization that put these kids on this Pelurskite throne in order to power the Pelurskite.
I think the default central hook that will draw your characters to the town is just really strong, which is that pure Pelurskite is preposterously rare, it's valuable, and it only comes from one place. To paraphrase Way of the Gun, and it's not treasure, it's a motive with a universal adapter on it.
I have another great ghost encounter. This time it's an encounter with the woman who was murdered by Mac and Orig when she threatened to shut down Pelurskite production some years ago, decades ago, because she didn't want to put another boy on the throne. In this ghost encounter, what I love, there's a little detail where we are told that her clothes appear similar to the sort of striking yellow tartan that Mac Asgrel wears, but that it's out of fashion. It's a super big clue as to what's going on.
I'm also fond of the archway, which is one of the ruins you can discover on the island. I'll just read you a bit of the description. The keystone, if the party digs around to get a good look at it, is decorated with a humanoid figure sitting on a throne that is radiating lines with a wide open mouth.
And finally, there's a fantastic clue that Margie Bellin is on the island of Pelursk when you go searching around the shore, and that is that you find the Bellin mothers' dining table, their long dining table, overturned on the shore, and the players pretty quickly deduce that it was used as a raft that Margie used to get on the island, because there's only one boat. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. This week on the Expert Delve, we have something of a companion to the last episode's Expert Delve. If you'll recall, listeners, we talked about how do you unfurl important historical information to the players so that it doesn't feel gimmicky or cheap and that it's kind of satisfying to the players. This week, we want to talk about something slightly different, but in the same spirit, I think, which is how do you handle it when a player character is from a locale, such as Blacklake, or has special familiarity with the setting? And how do you handle that implied knowledge that the character must have? And let me just say at the outset why this topic came up to me, Tom. When I ran the Corruption of Pelursk, one of my players, two of them actually, they decided that they were natives of Blacklake. So they decided, well, I grew up in Blacklake. And one of them was even like, I'm one of the Bellin children. Right? So, yeah. So it was, they decided, and that was great. I loved it. That's the nature of collaborative play. Like, I was really into it. But suddenly the situation was, oh shit, you're from Blacklake. So you might know some of this stuff. You might know some of the, you might know about the person that Orig succeeded to feed the island. You might know about Mac's, predatory business practices and all that stuff, right? And so I was presented with a bit of a dilemma of like, well, how do you handle, like, those characters are going to have knowledge of Blacklake, And so, yeah, I thought we'd just talk about that. I have some very, very specific thoughts. In fact, just a tool that I used basically, but I'm curious to kind of open with your thoughts though, Tom.
Okay, sure. So I think the biggest issue with this is always what I'm sure I'm not the only one that calls it the Galaxy Quest problem, because I think I got this name from someone else. But in that film, which is now getting on for like 20 years old, probably.
God, I feel so fucking old. Yeah,
I know, man. I know. But Sigourney Weaver's character is an actress called Gwen. I looked it up. And on this Star Trek-like TV show, all she ever got to do was repeat what the ship's computer said. So the ship's computer says, shields at 5%, and she gets to go, shields are at 5%, Captain. And that's literally it. And this is kind of what happens with the situation of a character knowing something, but the player having to check with the GM. So, in small amounts, it doesn't matter that much. You just say something like, do I know where there's a fishmonger? It's like, yeah, sure, down the road. And then fine. But after a while, it gets pretty tiresome. So, the conversation would be like, a companion says, what's that blue glow coming from your cottage up ahead? And then the player says to the GM, do I recognize the blue glow?
Do I recognize that blue glow?
Yeah.
I was raised under that blue glow.
Yeah. And then the GM says, yes, those are the flawed blue crystals that are used for light. Oh, right. Okay, mate, those are the blue flawed crystals. And it's just like,
right, yeah.
So finding a way out of that is pretty useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what are your thoughts on finding your way out of it?
Well, there are a few things you can do. In, like, Corruption of Pelursk, you could actually just give them a little you're from around here cheat sheet, because there's not that much to know about Pelursk necessarily that is, you don't need to know loads and loads of things to show that you're a native. You would need to know crystals come from the island. Flawless crystals are precious and magical, although I think actually everyone in the setting is implied to know that, right?
Yeah, because that's where they're going. They're going to get
exactly.
some. Yeah.
So blue crystals are for light, yellow are for heat. Mac Asgril is the guy who trades the crystals. Only Orig goes to the island. Only he's allowed a boat. And if you give someone a half a sheet of paper with that written on it, that's all the background info they need to put themselves ahead of the other players,
Yeah, that's a good, straightforward tip, I think, as far as that goes.
But of course, you can't do that. It's not practical all the time. In fact, very rarely is it practical. I would say it's only in this kind of situation where it's a smallish village with a very unusual background. The next thing you can do is that you just ask the player as the GM, and if the answer is not vital to the atmosphere that you're trying to create, and if there's no danger that it's going to contradict something that needs to be true in the future, you could just say, "Who's allowed to set foot on the island?" And they'll go, and make up an answer. But sometimes, it does need to be restricted, right? Because someone could go, "Oh yeah, everyone's allowed onto the island whenever they want." And you'd have to go, no, hang on. So when that's the case, you need to kind of ask leading, indirect questions. So you got to establish the fact in the setup, but leave the player free so their answer can be whatever they want it to be. But what you're actually doing is giving them info in the question. So in this case, you would say, when you were growing up, what reasons did you hear for why only Orig is allowed to go to the island?
Right. Yeah, because the important part is that only Orig is allowed to go to the island. Right?
And
it's the classic, this is a painting of a parrot. What does a parrot look like, right? But it's a painting of a parrot, right? Like it's still a parrot.
Exactly. So, and this isn't really subterfuge. Everyone's going to know what you're doing, but for some reason it just feels better when you do it this way. So, yeah, it's I would say probably the most seamless way you have to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I like all that. I like the idea of indirect leading questions. I've used that. The last methodology you described of just asking the players, to sort of fill in that detail. It's what I like to call the wrong spout lore approach, because a lot of people play Dungeon World. They use the spout lore move, and what they do is they let the player fill in the lore, but that's actually wrong. The GM fills in the lore, but they find it more fun to let the player do it. And I can see that. It's a collaborative thing.
I used a version like that in my long-running Yunsuin game, actually, where it was, you get to answer and you get a +1 forwarder if you're acting on the answers, even if they turn out to be wrong. That's the thing. I still reserved the right for it not to actually be true.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Well, and actually, I think some of the Chaos World supplements for Dungeon World published by Magpie Games, a lot of them rejigger spout lore to be more player facing, player, feeding information. But that's a danger, right? And it's a danger that you pointed out, which is the player's answer or the player's, filling in the knowledge or whatever might conflict pretty strongly with what you've prepared or the module, right? And so it's just something to be mindful of. I like your idea of the indirect leading question. That's pretty good. Let me tell you how I handled it. So, a bit of preamble. In Dungeon World and other Powered by the Apocalypse games in this show, we like to blend story game and PBTA game approaches with more traditional OSR type approaches. In PBTA games, there's this concept called hold. Okay. And hold is an abstract currency that represents really anything. It's an abstraction it's a currency that the player can spend to do X based off whatever the hold is, right? And so what I do in situations like this where the player character is from the location of the setting or has some kind of particular knowledge, what I do is I give the player hold, usually 3 hold, but you can kind of change the numbers around, right? If the character was, only lived in Black Lake for the last 6 months or so, then maybe you give them 1 hold. But if they grew up there, maybe you give them 3 hold, right? But the idea is they can spend the hold to then ask me, the GM, any question they want, right? And so it keeps it gamified, right? It's still a game. It's still a mechanic that you have to interact with. It's still something that the players have to be mindful of and whether they want to spend their hold or not. But it's an efficient way of solving the problem, right? how the problem being the character should know something, but we can't sit here writing down everything they should know. I mean, maybe the basics like the colors of the crystals and all that. We can't write it all down. And importantly, we only really want to see in play them sharing their knowledge about the important stuff, right? Like, we don't care if they know the different types of nog served at the Bell Inn, right? No one gives a shit about that. What people care about is, do they understand the controversies surrounding the island? Do they understand, who used to do the Orig's job before Orig? Like, just things like that, right? And so that's what I do. And that worked great because I had two characters who had different levels of historical attachment to Blacklake. And I gave one of them 2 hold. I gave the other one 3 hold. And it worked like a charm. Like, the players very carefully spent their hold when it seemed like an appropriate moment. And that was great. And where it was just not possible for them to know something, like where I could not justify telling them something because I don't think their characters would have encountered this in their youth, I just didn't let them ask that question. I just said, nope, sorry, that's not what I'm going to answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's really versatile as well. Because I think what you've got there is something that on the face of it violates the Galaxy Quest problem principle. But on the other hand, in a way, it doesn't, because you're actually giving... I was about to say permission. That sounds like it's the GM is king kind of thing. I mean, permission in the sense of how we talk about character traits sometimes, having the carpentry skill gives you permission to try and make a decent table, that kind of thing. And because you're establishing the relationship to the town, the village, I keep thinking of it as a village. It's actually quite big, isn't it, the Lake Town? They can ask questions that kind of transgress the boundary of the normal player to GM what's going on question. Because they're allowed to ask you anything, they can ask you insanely leading questions that establish some facts, which you then have to respond to.
They can do that, yeah, that's true.
Which is which of the many secret ways into the manor house was the last to be discovered by Mac Asgore or whatever his name is. They can sneak things in that you would then maybe you could turn it down and go, that's not really playing fair, but a lot of the time it will probably spark an idea in your head and you'll be like, yeah, that's right, there is an old crumbling well.
I'm inclined to do that. If a player does that, I'm super inclined to just roll with it, right, and try to figure out because they're telling you what they're interested in, right? And I think that's gold as a GM, like whenever your players tell you what they're interested in those ways. But that's how I've always handled that, and it works great. I mean, it works great. You can apply it to all kinds of situations, right? Like if you have a character in some fantasy game who has told us already that, okay, I've spent a huge amount of time studying this particular art or these particular people or whatever, right? You don't want to get into the details of what that means, I mean, maybe sometimes you just tell the players things that are obvious that they would know, but maybe you give them some hold to spend, and then they can spend that hold to ask you for super relevant information. It's effective. It's super effective. I've been doing it for years. Yeah,
it's nice. I think I might, if I were to adopt it, I'd maybe give them 2 or 3 sample questions they could ask about their field of knowledge as well. Like if you think about in Apocalypse World, how the brainer gets a different set of creepy questions to ask people compared to the normal reader person. Might do that. I also like the idea of giving out hold based on experience. I mean, as in based on knowledge accumulated. I think that's pretty good instead of making anyone do a roll for it. So that's, nice.
Yeah, because sometimes you don't want to roll, right? Like, because sometimes, like in a PBTA game, you could just have them roll spout lore or know some shit or whatever the equivalent moves are in other games, you can have them do that, right? But sometimes it doesn't make any sense because it's like, if they know that, they know that, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, like the spout lore is for the broad canvas of all of human existence, right? You might just happen to know it, but if it's where you grew up, of course you either know it or you don't.
Yeah, there's no role there, right? So yeah. But you still want to put some kind of like limitations on the player, right, to make it fun. Anyway, those are my thoughts there. Do you have any other thoughts on this topic?
No, I have literally no more thoughts on this topic.
Awesome. You spent all your hold.
I did.
Let's go to Companion Adventures. Hi, listeners. I want to take a minute to tell you about the newest issue of Codex, the Gauntlet's RPG magazine. It's called Codex Dark 2, and it's a sequel to the original Codex Dark. Here is what you'll find inside. Ghost Drums, a story game / LARP about vengeful ghosts that deals with themes of colonialism and regret. A Repast of Glum Moments, a collection of inspirational morsels for Swords Without Master and other dark fantasy fiction. Trophy, a psychological horror game about a group of explorers pushing ever deeper into a forest that doesn't want them there. Orchestra of Oblivion, which features new bloodlines for the excellent gothic horror game Rhapsody of Blood. Our newest miscellany, 36 Constellations, 8 beautiful illustrations, and a custom layout by Jake Householder. You can get Codex Dark 2 by pledging $4 on the Gauntlet Patreon by December 31st. And a reminder, back issues of Codex are available on DriveThruRPG. Thanks. It's Companion Adventures. Let's do films. Tom, what do you got?
I have got the 1979 Soviet film Stalker, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky, which is about, going to a weird region of geography where everything's a bit wrong and you have to take circuitous routes to not die from weird traps. In the scenario, the Corruption of Pelursk, Orig occupies a kind of stalker-like position in the town. He's the only one that's allowed to... Well, I think the stalkers are not supposed to go in to the zone in the film and novel. But, so he has that kind of... He's the only one who has the experience to go there. Yeah, I don't recommend... Well, no, I do recommend the book Roadside Picnic. It's very good, but not for this. I don't think it's weird and scary in the same way as the zone in the film Stalker is. And you can see Stalker for free on YouTube with English subtitles because the studio that made it, Mosfilm, has published it on their YouTube channel.
I have selected the 2007 film There Will Be Blood, starring the great Daniel Day-Lewis. I think that the character Mac Asgrel, who is the merchant trader of the Pelursk crystals, I think that character wants to be played as a sort of deranged robber baron, and indeed that's not how Shell wrote him, but that's how I played him. And Daniel Day-Lewis's performance in that movie is something that you should have in your archive anyway. Like, that archive that Tom and I talk about all the time, your archive of character role-playing types. That is a good one. And also, I think it's a great movie because it deals with the same themes as The Corruption of Pelursk, which is this sort of cross-current and sort of clash between like religion and greed and the sort of ironies and juxtapositions of that.
Yeah, and also based on a slightly anti-capitalist novel by Upton Sinclair. So
Oil, yep, sure was. Yeah. How about music, Tom?
Yeah, so for music, I have got maybe not the most on-the-nose choice. I've got the album England Made Me by Black Box Recorder from 1998. A lot of the Black Box Recorder oeuvre has this same kind of what I think is the Black Lake town mood in it, but I think England Made Me is the one that has most of what you need, which is this sort of idea of a kind of shabby respectability. Everyone's quite proud of how rich they are, and they don't realise that actually they're slightly being ripped off. Or these sinister little family secrets, intimations of murder and other horrible things in the background of the lyrics, all to a downbeat kind of synth poppy musical backing. So yeah, England Made Me. Strongly recommended anyway, but particularly for this scenario.
I'm going to go with an NPR program, long-running NPR program called The Thistle and Shamrock. Black Lake and the setting is presented as a sort of like not Scotland to me. There are lots of like sort of like, not Scotland ideas in there. So I think that maybe some kind of Celtic or Scottish kind of influenced music is a great fit. Perhaps something you might hear being played in the Bell Inn as your characters are spending time there. And players, I found, do like to spend a lot of time in the Bell Inn. It's surprisingly appealing. So that is something you might consider. The Thistle and Shamrock is a program put on by Fiona Ritchie. It's something I used to listen to all the time in Dallas on their public radio station. It's not carried by all the NPR stations, but thanks to the power of the internet, you can go listen to it whenever you want. So go check it out. And listeners, that's our show. If you would like to get in touch with The Gauntlet, which is the outfit that produces this show, you can go to Twitter and tweet at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Pledge at the $6 or higher level. And you can join the Gauntlet Slack group and hang out with Tom and I and ask us all kinds of questions about old school fantasy modules. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you very much.
And also thanks to Paul, our editor. And listeners, thanks for listening. Take care.
Goodbye. That's
that's
my fantasy narrator voice. Do you like it?
I thought it was very good. Yeah, I liked it. Yeah, I was very impressed.